anybody who would violate your constitution, potentially use physical violence to end democracy is a tyrant, is a dictator. And this is happening in the middle of Europe.
En 3 años, bajo Pedro Sánchez y su gobierno de socialistas y comunistas, el acoso a los jueces y fiscales ha llegado a niveles propios de regímenes chavistas iberoamericanos. El abuso de los medios públicos y privados para la propaganda del gobierno y para los ataques a la oposición, con descalificación y criminalización de la misma, es propio de sistemas no democráticos.
Hoy en día, lo que estamos viendo, yo creo, en América Latina, es una lucha para capturar las fiscalías y las cortes, más allá que el poder ejecutivo, para instalar una nueva forma de dictadura, que es una dictadura judicial, más allá que una dictadura ejecutiva. Yo creo que Brasil, más bien, es el laboratorio por este experimento. Lula puede venir o puede ir. Él ya fue preso y ya el señor tiene muchos años, sí, y no sé cuánto tiempo va a durar, pero Moraes en Brasil puede ser el dictador por mucho tiempo más, mientras controla las cortes y también las fiscalías. En América Latina hay por lo menos 8 países que hay una pelea dura para capturar las fiscalías. Guatemala, Honduras, Salvador, Colombia, Ecuador, Perú, hasta incluso aquí en España. Que si Pedro Sánchez sale del poder, pero instalan los nuevos fiscales y las cortes, los magistrados en las cortes, esta dictadura puede permanecer.
La fiscal del caso ecuatoriano, que la vamos a ver, una total inepta, se reporta en la Embajada de Estados Unidos. Creen que no la ven cuando entran a la Embajada de Estados Unidos. Es totalmente dependiente del embajador de Estados Unidos.
El fiscal olvida una cosa: yo soy el jefe del Estado.
Presidente,
por tanto, el jefe de él.
Welcome to San Diego, California. We're outside of the Coronado Amphibious Naval Air Base, as well as the Naval Air Station on North Island. This is where a lot of our aircraft carriers are ported. This is a very significant part of the United States because it's pretty much the major naval station where we fought World War II, the base of where we fought World War II. In fact, after December 1941, everyone remembers the attack on Pearl Harbor. Pretty much the next 6 months was a major naval battle against the Japanese Imperial Navy that ended in June 1942 with the Battle of Midway. And so why I'm giving you that context is because I think now we're on the precipice of another World War, World War III. But World War III will look nothing like World War I and World War II. There will be conventional military aspects of the warfare. Naval will be a big part of it. But as 21st century warfare has shown, there's other elements, informational, political, legal, that create a much broader spectrum of warfare. And that's what this video is going to be about. We spent a considerable amount of time in the last couple months in both Spain, in Poland, and in Prague. And these countries in particular, I think, are both being under assault in an asymmetric fashion, but they're also part of this attack on Western civilization through political and legal warfare. Spain in particular, I'm sure everybody has been watching the protests that are mounting in Spain against the socialist government of Pedro Sanchez, a government that has been completely violated both its constitution and its rule of law by creating an amnesty program for the separatists in Spain that actually were always been fundamentally backed by the Russians. So this is an extension of Russia's war throughout Europe, obviously coming in Ukraine, attacking Poland through mass migration, through proxy networks, and now I think its focus is attention on Spain as well. So we're going to go to Madrid. Come with me. Let's go to Madrid, and you'll hear first from some of our friends in our colleagues out in the Vox political party who are on the front lines of the fight in Spain, trying to save the Spanish culture and the Spanish rule of law from the autocratic attempts of the socialist government of Pedro Sanchez.
Welcome to Madrid, Spain, a beautiful country in what they call the old world in many parts of Latin America. This is an important time, and this is important not just for Spain, it's important also for Europe. And I'd say it's actually important for all of what's called Iberoamerica, which includes Latin America and Caribbean, the regions that we usually work with. I'm here in Spain because I'm participating in this conference, a very important conference that's put together by a very important think tank that's called New Direction. New Direction puts this event together called Advancing Freedom, and the event's called Think Tank Central. It's called Think Tank Central because it brings a coalition of right-of-center think tanks that believe in freedom as a common denominator, that have differences on many different issues, such as social issues, cultural issues, but all generally agree that the underlying principle to advance a free society is to defend freedom. They're going to be meeting here in Madrid, Spain, because we're going to be talking about coalitions. We're here at the Avenida Castellana de Madrid. This is one of the main highways of Madrid, one of the main city centers. And this is actually where a lot of their national defense is located. On my left, you're gonna have elements of the Ministry of Defense of Spain. And on my right, you have the Centro de Estudios Superiores de Defensa Nacional. It's essentially kind of like a national defense university for Spain, where they train and educate their senior military leaders and those of other countries. In fact, we just saw a delegation coming out from the building a few minutes ago. So in our meeting with them, we're going to talk a lot about the national defense priorities of Spain, how they're engaging in what they call the cultural defense, building a cultural defense for Spain, maintaining the sovereignty and protecting their democracy. This is very important given what's everything that's happening politically in this country, and obviously what's happening in Europe with Russia's invasion of Ukraine.
Sabemos que en todo conflicto internacional, como que es el que se está produciendo entre Ucrania y Rusia, importa también mucho la narrativa. Yeah. ¿Cómo valora la narrativa que se ha construido alrededor de Estados Unidos y sobre todo también ese empeño en vincular a Donald Trump con Moscú?
Eso es muy importante lo que acabas de decir, porque hoy en día los que estudian guerra, los que son estrategas de guerra es nada más y nada menos que imponer tu voluntad en otro. Cuando hablamos de Estado-Nación, estamos hablando de voluntad política, y eso es cuestión de narrativas. El problema con la narrativa de Estados Unidos en este momento es han elaborado una narrativa de democracias contra autocracias. El problema con esa narrativa es que no hay ningún país en el mundo que se declara autocrático. Todos los países más autocráticos del mundo se llaman democracias, o ellos mismos se disfrazan de democracia. Entonces lo que tenemos que hacer es entrar a las premisas que qué hace una democracia. La soberanía, la libertad, los derechos humanos, y tenemos que explicar esto y defender esto a nivel mundial, lo que no estamos haciendo en este momento.
¿Estamos realmente hacia una reconfiguración o a lo más parecido a un aislamiento de Estados Unidos por parte de las potencias clásicas, China, Rusia, más Irán, etcétera? ¿Cómo lo ves?
Estados Unidos tiene que tomar un rol distinto en el sentido que tenemos que regresar a los orígenes de qué nos hizo grande, qué nos hizo poderosos, porque no solamente la economía y las Fuerzas Armadas. O sea, nosotros tenemos ideales, tenemos visiones que ya de cierta forma nos hemos perdido durante el transcurso del tiempo. Tengo un pequeño ejemplo. Hoy en día se habla mucho de democracias contra países autocráticos, ¿no? Eso es justo el documento de la Seguridad Nacional de la Casa Blanca, se publicó en octubre del año anterior, habla de esto. Pero hay un error, hay una falta en esa premisa de democracias contra autocracias, y es que nadie se considera autocrático. O sea, todos los países más autocráticos del mundo se llaman democracias. Entonces, en vez de defender la democracia, estamos en una fase donde tenemos que definir, y en esa definición yo creo que tenemos que entrar a lo más esencial de una democracia, que es la soberanía.
La presidenta de Vox en la Comunidad de Madrid y una guerrera americana, hispanoamericana, que todos conocemos. Muchas gracias.
los del Foro de Sao Paulo, los del Grupo del Pueblo, los que ahora están intentando hacerse con el poder en España, que esa nacionalidad que tenías, y ese pasaporte que tenías, y esos derechos que tenías desaparecen para siempre. Y eso es lo que estamos viendo hoy en España, cómo nos estamos acercando al precipicio en que los políticos pasan por encima de la ley, pasan por encima de la Constitución, dan la amnistía a quienes han dado un golpe de Estado, a quienes son unos delincuentes. Y cuando pasas por encima de la ley, cuando acabas con el Estado de Derecho, cuando acabas con las libertades y la igualdad de todos, que es lo que se supone que teníamos garantizado en España, nunca está garantizado, pues entonces te acercas a una dictadura, que es lo que por desgracia otros pues conocemos bien. Tenemos la obligación moral de defendernos, de defender las libertades, de defender a nuestra nación.
Estados Unidos no va a poder hacer esto solo. Necesitamos formar alianzas. Los esfuerzos que tenemos que hacer es fuera de gobierno, es dentro de la sociedad civil, es dentro de los parlamentos, es hasta a nivel subnacional, con alcaldías y gobernadores. Y yo creo que todos tenemos que apoyar a Argentina. Lo que estamos haciendo aquí es lo más importante que se puede hacer. Por eso yo dije que yo vine a pesar de las distancias, porque si no hacemos esto, nadie lo va a hacer y con eso yo creo que la unión es la respuesta.
Gracias.
We have a very distinguished panel today with Liliane Schmies and also with Joseph Humire and Dr. Azim Ibrahim. We're going to start more with Europe because Liliane Schmies is from Poland. She's an energy and geopolitics expert and also the president of Warsaw Institute. Liliane, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you very much for inviting me here. And not to waste much more time. So if we're comparing the first Cold War with the second one, I think, well, there are some similarities, but also a lot of differences. And I think one of the biggest differences is that China right now is much wealthier and more connected to global economy than Soviet Union ever was. Increase troops numbers and also funding in the Indo-Pacific region. So at the same time, Europe should also increase the spending in defense sector.
Welcome to Warsaw, Poland. I'm bringing you over here to Europe because I think there's no country in the world that represents the fight for freedom more than here, the Polish people, a country that has lost its territorial integrity, basically lost its sovereignty for many periods throughout history, but continue to resist, continue to fight, and knows what the struggle for independence and freedom truly means. The theme of this video, this On the Move, is called Saving Western Civilization, because I believe we're at a point in history that Western civilization is being threatened by this authoritarian alliance of Russia, China, Iran, creating conflicts all over the world. We have the war in Ukraine right next door. We also have the Gaza war in Israel, that was the brutal assault by Hamas on October 7th. And there's probably going to be more conflicts to come in the near future. And if we're talking about the Cold War, there really is two heroes that we should mention. One here from Poland, Lech Walesa. He was the leader of the Solidarity movement, the anti-Soviet movement that helped Poland break free from the iron grip of the Soviet Union. And obviously President Ronald Reagan. We're here at the Ronald Reagan Monument here in Warsaw that was unveiled in 2011 by Lech Walesa. And I think that that's very symbolic as to what we're looking to face into the future. And to understand where we're going, we have to understand where we've been. We're going to be visiting parts of Poland, such as the Warsaw Uprising Monument, the Royal Castle. We're going to be then heading to Prague to visit a lot of the foreign relations that are happening in that country and the changes, the recent election in Slovakia. And all along the way, we're going to be talking about Latin America, because Latin America is part of Western civilization. Some people call it the cousin of the West in Europe and North America. I call it like our brother, because it may be a younger brother, but it's an important brother in this struggle to save Western civilization.
Latin America is maybe the forgotten cousin of the West, the lost tribe of the West.
So it's important that we're here in the Visegrad countries of Europe to talk about what's happening in Venezuela, to talk about what's happening in Cuba, Nicaragua, to talk about this progressive movement that's sweeping all over Latin America, that's connected to the progressive movements here in Europe, particularly in Spain, and to rebuild this new transatlantic alliance that's sorely needed in order to defend ourselves from the authoritarian alliance that's taking over the world. President Biden's speech had a lot of policy implications, because several months later, in October of 2022, the first post-Ukraine invasion national security strategy was put out by the White House.
A battle between democracy and autocracy, between liberty and repression, between a rules-based order and one governed by brute force. In this battle, we need to be clear-eyed.
And if you read the document, the National Security Strategy of 2022, and you compare it to President Biden's speech here in Warsaw, it has a lot of the same vocabulary. The concept of dividing the world into democracies and authoritarians was the undertone of both Biden's speech and the National Security Strategy of 2022. However, I believe there's a lot of flaws in that premise. And it's mostly because the collection of countries that consider themselves democracies don't have it universally defined. There are countries that consider themselves more of a plural participatory democracy, and then there are countries that consider themselves more, as we do in the United States, a representative democracy with the checks and balances that match a specific way of governance. But the real problem is that authoritarian countries don't consider themselves authoritarian. No authoritarian country in the world calls themselves or their leaders autocrats. Matter of fact, the biggest autocrats in the world, and that includes Russia's Vladimir Putin, considers everybody else to be the authoritarian, which is why I believe that the way to contextualize global affairs in terms of democracies versus authoritarians is missing something. And I believe that something is very evident here in Warsaw, Poland, and particularly in the 1944 Warsaw Uprising.
The same is true in Warsaw, where street signs carry the name of George Washington and a monument stands to one of the world's greatest heroes, Ronald Reagan. And so I am here today, not just to visit an old ally, but to hold it up as an example for others who seek freedom and who wish to summon the courage and the will to defend our civilization.
5 years before President Biden came here to Warsaw, Poland to give his speech, President Trump gave a very similar speech with a very different message. He chose right here in Kalinsky Square here in Warsaw, and he chose to give his message here because of the Warsaw Uprising Monument, where I think is no better place to give a specific message about Western civilization. This is perhaps one of the best speeches that President Trump gave throughout his entire presidency, particularly on foreign policy. And the undertone of his speech was about saving Western civilization and defining and defending the concept of national sovereignty. It was beyond just talking about abstractions of democracy versus authoritarianism, but to talk about what defines a democracy, what makes a democracy successful and delivers for its people. And in that concept, it turns into policy. Because months later, President Trump's White House released their national security strategy, the 2017 National Security Strategy. And if you haven't read this document, I highly recommend that you read the 2017 National Security Strategy, because it broke with 20 plus years of failed foreign policy. Meaning that for many years, presidents of the United States, both Republican and Democrat, embraced a policy of either resetting relations with Russia or trading with China and incorporating them into the international financial architecture. The 2017 National Security Strategy clearly states that that was a failed policy. That not only should we not embrace Russia and China in this regard, but we should compete with both of them and introduce strategic competition into the vernacular of the US government, a policy that has maintained to today. And I think after the Russia's invasion of Ukraine, it's not just competition, but in many respects there's direct conflict with these authoritarian actors. One of the unique characteristics of Poland and Warsaw in particular is not only do they have a history of fighting communism, but obviously they have a history of fighting Nazism and anti-Semitism. And before the 1944 Warsaw Uprising, I learned a lot about 1943 and what's called the Warsaw Ghetto Resistance Movement, which basically was a resistance movement that fought against the Nazi occupation and stopped the persecution of the Jewish communities. And this is the memorial, what's called the Warsaw Ghetto Memorial. And I think today, in today's day and age, with what Hamas has done and doing in the Gaza Strip, the threat against Israel and Jewish people around the world, I think it's very important to remember. I remember here in Poland, they have Auschwitz, some of the concentration camps that the Nazis have used against the Jewish people. And I think the key to liberating the Polish people was liberating the Jewish people, which is one of the largest Jewish communities in the world, right here in Poland. And I think it has a lot of significance today with what's going on in Israel. If you want to marry the two wars that are going on between Russia and Ukraine and between Hamas and Israel, and let's be honest, Hamas, Iran, and Hezbollah against Israel, you could find those two wars that were fought in many respects, elements, not of that specific war, but elements of those conflicts here in Poland and Warsaw. We're here at Forum 2000 here in Prague, Czech Republic, and I wanted to share a quick anecdote about the conference, about Forum 2000, its connection to the Center for Secure Free Society. And many people don't know this, but the founding of SFS, it took a long time to basically establish itself as an independent center in 2012, but the founding of SFS actually dates back to this conference many years ago in 2004 by a gentleman named Oldra Cherny. Oldra Cherny was the executive director of Forum 2000 for several years. He was actually the head of foreign intelligence for Václav Havel. And a lot of anyone that's studied the Czech Republic, you understand that the transition from communism and the independence of having the Czech Republic after it broke up, when it was Czechoslovakia previously, has to do with the reform efforts of Václav Havel. Václav Havel entrusted his friend Oldra Cherny to essentially lead parts of that transition, particularly on the aspect of post-communist transition of its economy, taking into consideration the security threats that were still imminent from Russia. So Forum 2000 was established, I believe it was like in 1998, if I remember right. Then the Prague Security Studies Institute, which Oldra Cherny actually headed, was established in 2002. And in 2004, they had a conversation with the founder of SFS and one of my mentors, Alex Chafuen, where they discussed the concept of having an international security network, much the same way that the Atlas was establishing an international economic network of free market economists. But this would be free market economists, or better yet, freedom champions that also champion the idea of national security. So in many respects, we owe a lot to this conference, Forum 2000. We owe a lot to Oldra Cherny for all the efforts he did. He unfortunately passed away in 2012. We mourn his loss as we did more than 10 years ago, but his legacy remains well alive with not just the conference, but also the Center for Secure Free Society. One of the reasons I was very excited about speaking here at Forum 2000 was to kind of come back home, especially after the 10th year anniversary of SFS. And so this was a very important conference, important meeting, especially given this time with the war in Ukraine, the war in Gaza, and unfortunately the other wars that look to be bubbling up in the very near future. So please visit Prague Security Studies Institute, visit Forum 2000. It's a very important conference under building kind of a democratic solidarity around the world of free and independent nations.
Nacionalismo cívico es tener amor por tu patria, es tener amor por tu bandera, es tener amor de donde venís. Y aquí en estos países, en República Checa, en Polonia, en Hungría, entienden esto, ¿no? Y yo te voy a decir algo como veterano de combate. Cuando tú vas a la guerra, no es la democracia que va a estar pasando por tu mente, es la bandera que tienes en tu brazo y la bandera que tiene tu soldado, porque estás luchando por algo y la identidad de tu nación. Y ese concepto de Estado-nación es lo que dio la democracia el oxígeno para que empiece a ser una democracia que represente a los individuos ciudadanos dentro de un mundo anárquico. Porque yo, Joseph, con toda mi libertad que tengo en el mundo, soy muy poco que pueda hacer contra misiles hipersónicos de China. Yo invierto en un Estado-nación para defender a mi propiedad, a mi vida y a mi persona. Cuando eso se quita, estamos viviendo un mundo de imperios.
Well, I hope you enjoyed this video of On the Move. Here we were in Warsaw, we were in Madrid, and now we're back in Prague in the Czech Republic. You got to see important conferences such as Forum 2000, I think one of the most important conferences in the West and in the world about building democratic solidarity among many different governments and think tank civil society. And then obviously the Advancing Freedom Think Tank Central Conference put together by New Direction and what they did in Madrid and they've done in previous places in Europe about bringing together a true conservative coalition, everything from national conservatives to classical liberals to libertarians and others that believe in the principles and values of individual liberty, but also nation-state sovereignty, which I think is why it's important we're here in Prague. You know, here behind me you see the Prague Castle, which is, according to the Guinness Book of World Records, the largest castle still in existence. It's been around since the 9th century. It's the largest ancient castle in the world. And I think it represents a lot of what is the old world transitioning to the new world, the story of Western civilization, and really the international order that we talk a lot about, the democratic, representative democracy and the democratic international order, which really gave its birth in 1648 after the 30-year wars and the Peace of Westphalia. But the Peace of Westphalia would have never come to fruition had it not been for the Battle of Prague, which is why I think here in Prague it has a special significance as to what it means to saving the West. And I would go even a step further because this is during the period of the 17th century, but even in more modern times with the threat of communism during the Cold War, you know, the Forum 2000 conference, Václav Havel, the efforts of many people in Prague to essentially do an effective post-communist transition is equally important. So I kind of want to end this video with the words of what President Trump said in 2017 in his speech in Warsaw. Now you saw parts of that speech, but he gave a very specific part of his speech that I think is worth reciting. I'm going to read it, but you're also going to hear the words directly from President Trump himself. And it begins, this is a speech by President Trump in 2017 in Warsaw, Poland. And it begins when President Trump says, "And when the day came on June 2nd, 1979, and 1 million Poles gathered around Victory Square for the very first Mass with their Polish Pope, that day, every communist in Warsaw must have known that their oppressive system would soon come to a crashing end. They must have known it at the exact moment during Pope John Paul II's sermon, when 1 million Polish men, women, and children suddenly raised their voices in a single prayer. 1 million Polish people did not ask for wealth, they did not ask for privilege. Instead, 1 million Poles saying 3 simple words: we want God."